we shall stand, whatever may befall, the richest in the land, the poorest of us all. We must all stick together, birds of a feather, and the clouds will soon roll by.
That's the 1943 song, We Must All Stick Together, by Billy Cotton and his band. Good morning, and welcome to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, May 7th, 2020, and this program is streaming live from KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. I'm Mary Massey. John Sakowitz is off today. We hope you'll join us again soon. Today's program takes a look at the possible origins of COVID-19. Is it man-made or coming directly from nature? Our listeners may call in today to speak with our guests at 707-923-3911. That's 923-3911, or they may email questions to be read on the air as time permits. The email address you can use, heroesandpatriots@gmail.com, heroesandpatriots@gmail.com. Views and opinions expressed on today's program are not necessarily those of the board, staff, and volunteers of KMUD Community Radio. And due to the shelter-in-place, today's program has us streaming from various parts of the country. Technology is wonderful until it doesn't work, so bear with us should we have any issues. Yesterday, Mike Pompeo called on China to provide virus samples from the virus outbreak and blamed Beijing for covering up dangers posted by the disease in persecuting Wuhan doctors. And then today, China has countered and slammed the United States for telling a lie. Our first guest to talk about the origins and the unfolding of this pandemic is Dr. Jonathan R. Latham. Dr. Latham is co-founder and executive director of the Bioscience Resource Project and the editor of Independent Science News. Dr. Latham is also the director of the Poison Papers Project, which publicizes documents of the chemical industry and its regulators. Dr. Latham holds a master's degree in crop genetics and a PhD in virology. He was subsequently a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Genetics at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He has published scientific papers in different disciplines as diverse as plant ecology, plant virology, genetics, and genetic engineering. He has written for Truth Out, MIT Technology Review, The Guardian, Resilience, Salon.com, and many other magazines and websites. So we are going to talk with him. Tanya, our engineer, do we have Dr. Latham on the line?
Yes, Mary, he's here with us.
Wonderful. Dr. Latham, welcome to Heroes and Patriots.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Very good. Well, I'd like to, there's so much swirling about us on the origins of COVID-19, as it seems to be the case whenever the severe illness comes about and affects our population. Could you just tell our listeners a little bit about what the Bioscience Resource Project concentrates on and what's your main emphasis of, what's your thrust of your program?
So, well, what we do is we try to look at food and agriculture issues. So COVID-19 and human disease is not really a central part of that, but I am a virologist. And so, when this COVID-19 outbreak kind of rose its ugly head, if you like, I kind of kept an eye on it, but we focus on food and agriculture and its linkages to, for example, between the use of pesticides and human health, or the use of pesticides and their dispersal in the environment and their effects on bees and things like that. And so GMO, we also work on GMO crops and their potential or actual hazards to humans, for example. So we have these diverse interests, but in a sense, they coalesce around the issue of COVID-19 in a sort of strange way that and some of this research and some of the impetus behind what's going on actually comes from the palm industry. So the palm oil industry is funding some of the research and supporting the researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, because essentially their interest is in deflecting blame for pandemics that might emerge from rainforests and wild areas from themselves and directing it towards wildlife traders. So these things end up being interconnected.
I see. And are you saying palm, P-A-L-M oil?
Yes. Yeah. Palm oil.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure. I was hearing. I'm on a cell phone. Sorry. So, in your estimation, is it possible? Now the White House administration is really stepping up their game on pointing the blame at China for biolab and bioterrorism, if you will, in recent 10 days or so. Could you give your sense of if there's any truth to that? And of course, China now is attacking us by saying we're liars and so forth. What is your take or perspective on the origins of this particular pandemic and as it relates to other pandemics like H1N1 and Ebola, etc.?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't believe this has anything to do with terrorism, right? I think that simply, if it did come from a lab, it was simply an accidental release. I don't think anybody was, even at the laboratory, was working on this terrorism, bioweapons type research, right? So that's a clarification. The second clarification that's really needed is that the money from the Wuhan lab, and much of it was coming from U.S. taxpayers, right? The U.S. government was paying for this research to a large extent. So,
really?
when people want to blame China, there is a bit of a problem there because this research was basically being redirected from money that would otherwise been spent on something similar in the U.S. So, but when you speak of, you want to know what is the possibility that this might happen. There's a long history of diseases breaking out from scientific research laboratories. I mean, you mentioned H1N1. I mean, when I was 12 years old, our whole school, I remember this well, our whole school became sick. Pretty much everyone in the school became sick from a flu virus. And I remember it well because I was at a boarding school, and all the dormitories ended up being hospital beds for us because the sanatorium was completely overflowing, and there were no students in the main part of the school because we were all in the sanatorium. And basically, that pandemic virus basically was released from a Russian lab. It was an accident, and people believe that they were trying to make a vaccine, but it was an accidental release. It went over the whole world and reverberated for years afterwards. That release. And so there is a long history. I've mentioned online smallpox outbreaks. I've mentioned all kinds of outbreaks that come from labs, and usually are contained, usually don't go too far, and so on and so forth. But there have been a huge number of these releases, and for example, the Department of Homeland Security is building a facility in Kansas, Manhattan, Kansas, which they estimated would lead to, over its 50-year lifetime, would lead to a 70% release, 70% probability release of some kind of pandemic organism, right? So it's not a wild accusation to say that a virology lab in China, which happens to be the world's leading research facility for bat coronaviruses, should release a bat coronavirus. That is not a wild possibility.
Sure. But it sounds like the United States right now, the Washington administration, is being very aggressive in pointing fingers at China and letting this happen. Now, one thing I read recently that Hong Kong and Thailand and even South Korea really shut their countries down right away, and therefore had very slow rates of and very low death rates. Whereas we, as the United States, did not heed that. Did we really get false information? Do you feel that China was withholding accurate information and that we were delayed because of it?
Well, there's many complications here. I mean, those countries didn't necessarily, their success in combating the virus wasn't really because they closed everything. It's because they did exhaustive testing and exhaustive tracing of people who came, who got the viruses, right? So they've had a public health system and a public health measures in place that have enabled them to keep a lid on this, whereas the U.S. doesn't really have those things, and so it ends up floundering because you just have isolated hospitals and isolated governors trying to order hospitals to do this, that, and the other, and on the other hand, you've got the Trump administration, which is trying to make this whole thing into a political football by blaming China. And, the U.S. is in the middle of trade negotiations with China, and I think Donald Trump is hoping that, by implying that China owes the world something, that he will get a better deal in his trade negotiations, I think is what's going on. Right.
And if news reports are accurate, we are nowhere near tracking the virus through contact and through active cases as compared to other countries. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes. I mean, I had a COVID-19 test about a month ago because I've had flu symptoms and so forth, and the test was negative. But I basically had to organize a test myself. This is the way it's been, and so the U.S. is totally disorganized, and the viral outbreak is going to get worse before it gets better. I think that's a virtual certainty.
And that's because we aren't testing and aren't tracking, I would assume, because we seem to be sheltering in place. I mean, in Northern California, we've been in lockdown since March 19th, and I was also sick the first part of March. I've been in lockdown since March 3rd or 4th. It just seems that's not enough.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that this thing broke out in China, in late December, and Western governments didn't really do anything, not only the U.S., they didn't really do anything until about March. And the thing is that the earliest cases, you basically takes 12 hours to get from Wuhan to Washington, D.C., or to New York, or to Seattle. So there's, probably there were cases extremely early in the U.S. and in Europe that nobody tracked and nobody did anything about. And the U.S. bungled its testing procedures. The CDC specifically rejected the World Health Organization's test and tried to develop its own and then failed to do so. So there's a whole catalog of errors that these governments are responsible for that they're now trying to push on us by making us shelter in place. Right? This is one of my personal complaints, is that they're demanding huge sacrifices from the population and from all the businesses that are being closed down and so on and so forth, but they haven't done their part, right? Their part is public health. Their part is providing tests. Their part is providing hospitals with equipment and so forth. And they have failed on every count.
Right. If you've just joined us, this is Heroes and Patriots, and you may call and speak to Dr. Latham at 707-923-3911, or you can email a question at heroesandpatriots@gmail.com.
And Mary,
I'm thinking...
Mary,
yes, go ahead.
We have a caller right now if you'd like to take a question.
Yes, that's great. Go ahead. Caller, you're on the air.
Thank you. Dr. Latham, I want to thank you very much for this informative and sound interview. I wanted to come back to the science a little bit and your work in virology. Do you think that if the virus did come from a lab, that might explain why they were able to sequence the genome so rapidly? And is there something more positive if it came from a lab that we might be able to work with them to find a better vaccine to test the immunity aspects? Is there something positive that actually would come out of someone admitting that it actually came from a lab and would make it easier to work with this virus to deal with the next steps?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that question. It's a good one. And there are several things. I mean, one is that they managed to get a sequence within a week or so of figuring out that it was a virus, and a whole bunch of labs came up with sequences, and they all agreed with each other more or less. So that sequencing process, which can lead in one direction to the development of treatments and vaccines and so forth, that was, a successful part of the response, if you like. And what's interesting is what didn't happen next. So I think, there are possibilities, but on the other hand, the likelihood of developing a vaccine, we don't have a vaccine against the common cold. Coronavirus vaccines are not easy to come by. So, a lot of people are pinning their hopes on the development of a vaccine. But I'm not sure that will ever happen, or at least, will happen in a very effective way. So there are a lot of questions around this.
Oh, and yes,
go ahead.
There's another question coming in from another caller, if you'd like it.
All right, go ahead. Caller, you're on the air.
Hello, thanks a lot for doing the show. I was wondering if the guest was familiar with animal transmission.
Not so much. In the case of this virus, I know that a tiger in the Bronx Zoo is considered to have caught the virus. But yeah, carry on with your question, nevertheless.
Okay, well, I read an article in Newsweek a few days ago, and they were talking about, I think his name is Dr. Fausser from Europe, maybe Denmark, and he came up with a way to transmit virus through ferrets called, I think it's animal transmission. And, hello?
I think I do know where you're going with this. Yeah, carry on.
And so, and in the article, they were talking about the debate between the ethics of that research and the possibilities that it could have been leaked that way. And then they also mentioned the different strains of the virus. They were saying there's an A, B, and C, and that that there isn't a patient zero, and the closest they could come to a patient zero wasn't near Wuhan and had no connection to the animal market there. And I guess, my question is, what through this process, is it possible that even someone with a makeshift lab could do this? And then my other question is whether or not they also mentioned that the virus might have been released a lot earlier, may have been transmitted a lot earlier in Europe in December. I was wondering if you had any comments on any of that. Thank you very much for being there, and I'll take my answers off the air. Thanks.
Thank you, caller. Go ahead, Dr. Latham.
So there's a lot of questions in there, right? So one of them is about the animal transmission of this experiments of this Dr. Fouchier. So in Amsterdam, he was doing experiments basically transmitting viruses between ferrets, and the idea was to generate viruses that are, more lethal to ferrets, more transmissible between ferrets, and so forth. And, what that experiment raised a lot of alarms, because essentially what has been done in many of these labs is to generate viruses that are more transmissible and more lethal as a way of demonstrating that money should be spent on this research because these are potential pandemic pathogens. But you have this kind of horrible circle going on in which people are basically doing research that endangers the public and themselves sometimes, basically on the basis of prevention of pandemics. And, so you have basically, on the one hand, you've got people doing dangerous experiments, and on the probably, many people would argue not necessary, but also that there are people, their long history of these lab releases is that in many cases the people who released the lab organisms were making vaccines, right? So you've got this complicated scenario in which you want to try to make a vaccine, you want to try to make treatments, but you want to do that without endangering the population, and you want to learn about these viruses without endangering the populations. And we are not getting the balance right. These experiments, what was going on in the Wuhan lab, if you look at their grant proposal, we don't know really what they were doing. This is one of the problems. But we do know that their grant proposal involved taking bits of viruses and splicing them together and putting them into human cells and into mouse cells and into animal cells and seeing what would happen, right? And the answer is, when you see what happens, is sometimes you get pandemic-type organisms. And so this is something that we really don't want to happen. And when you have questions over the biosafety abilities of these labs, and you have quotes like that one from the Homeland Security that there was it would be a 70% probability of having a pandemic organism be released from that facility. That's just one facility, right? There are hundreds of these labs around the country doing these kinds of, around the world at least, doing these kinds of experiments. This is a very concerning situation.
Dr. Latham, your area of expertise besides virology is in genetics and plant life. Has there ever been a case where plant life has been genetically altered to perhaps make it into some kind of pandemic through our food system? Not to be too downer on this, but what's your take on that from your perspective and your work?
Yeah, I mean, the closest that we've come to that kind of situation is some research that we did in which we showed that the GMOs, crop GMOs, contain a viral, pieces of virus, many of them. The virus is called the cauliflower mosaic virus, and it contains, basically it's a plant pathogen, but it's a pathogen that was being used for one function, and it turns out that the genes that people have been putting into GMOs have other functions too. And some of those functions can do things like harm your immune system. So we have basically accidentally put into GMO crops virus proteins and virus pieces that do functions that actually, if you knew that that's what they did, you would never have put them in there in the first place. So that would be the closest that I would know of. But that's a scary situation all by itself, right? Proteins that harm the immune system, that's not good.
Right. Well, of course, in the particular area where I live, GMOs are very much frowned upon, but I know in the marijuana business it's been introduced in the crop. So it's a scary prospect. We have about 3 minutes left with you, Dr. Latham. Could you give our listeners a sense of where they could read your information, how they can keep up with this? Is there a website? And could you give us that information in the next 2 or 3 minutes?
For sure. So just the first thing is that this is a really important subject because really important decisions are being made about, what direction to go with treatment, who to blame for the pandemic. Is it wildlife traders, or is it the palm industry, or is it rainforest destruction in general, and so forth. So this is a really important discussion that's not really being had. And the last thing is we have a website called independentsciencenews.org, and at that website we've been putting more and more coronavirus information up. But on that page there are links. If you read the articles, they go into details about past lab releases and so forth. And we'll be publishing more in the near future about where we think this virus comes from. So that is the website that I recommend. But there are some others, too. There's one called GMWatch.org, which is a British one which covers GMO-type issues, which I really recommend as a reliable source. So those are great resources. But unfortunately, some of the institutions that used to cover, biowarfare research and bioweapons research have actually closed down, and so it's become difficult to get reliable information on these kinds of subjects.
Well, I hope you will come back and update us maybe in a few months, just to see where things shake out, and if there'll be another wave, and maybe we'll know more about the genetic code and mutations and so forth, and be more definitive on where this has come from.
I think we will know more. I don't think there will ever be proof one way or another. That science doesn't really work that way. So, but I hope we will have more information. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Latham.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Sure. I've been speaking with Jonathan Latham, who is the co-founder and executive director of Bioscience Resource Project, and he is the editor of Independent Science News, which has a fabulous list of articles on this and other topics, including GMOs and genetic crop engineering. Dr. Latham is also the director of the Poison Papers Project, which publicizes documents of the chemical industry and its regulators. He holds a master's degree in crop genetics and a PhD in virology, and he's very well respected in his field. So we're going to take a brief pause and get our next guest on the line. You're listening to Heroes and Patriots.